the previous administration in the fight against climate change. And we reinstate an essential tool in 2012 and 2016 while clearing a path for stronger protections in the future. And with today's vote, Mr. Speaker, Congress recognizes the danger methane poses, as well as the economic opportunity and certainty created with common sense and cost-effective limits on this pollution. Since the Senate already passed S.J. Res. 14 with a bipartisan vote of 52 to 42, it is now up to the House to do the same so we can send this resolution to the President's desk. And for the sake of our communities, our families, our country, and our future, I strongly urge all members to join me in supporting this joint resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong opposition to this resolution. Strong opposition to this resolution of disapproval of the EPA's methane policy rule. This resolution is another attack on the hardworking American men and women that supply energy, so important to our economy and our national security. Don't be mistaken, this is an attack on American energy security. And remember those gas lines from the 1970s? And remember the energy security and dominance truly captured in the last few years? In 2020, America became energy independent. It was a long-time goal. President Jimmy Carter established the Department of Energy with a goal of becoming energy independent, recognizing how important a diverse supply of energy is to America. So why is the majority moving forward right now? Gas prices are already on the rise, threatening our economic recovery and causing pain at the pump for Americans who are ready to put the pandemic behind them. We're still recovering from the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack, which shut down the nation's most important pipeline, causing supply shortages and price spikes. If it's not already obvious to the Democrats across the aisle, affordable and reliable supplies of gasoline are absolutely critical to our economy. It's critical to our way of life. This is a misguided resolution. Taken together with President Biden's executive orders banning oil and natural gas drilling on federal lands and canceling the Keystone XL pipeline, it will likely drive gas prices even higher. So why is the majority pushing this resolution? This resolution has next to nothing to do with protecting the environment or reducing methane emissions. The states and the EPA already regulate methane emissions, and we have a well-established program that supports the industry to go even further. Reducing methane emissions is a priority for all of us, for the oil and natural gas industry. And thanks to innovation and industry action, the United States methane emissions rates in the largest producing regions have declined 70% in the last decade, even as our production is surging. The United States is the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas. That's something that we should be celebrating. That is so foundational to our economy, to our national security. And in addition to that, we are leading the world in emission reductions at the same time. The United States of America has led the world in reducing carbon emissions, more than the next 12 countries combined, more than any other country in the world. Again, that's something that we should be celebrating. Let's not jeopardize that progress to fulfill the Green New Deal wish list. We all know that this resolution is unnecessary. President Biden has made his intentions very clear. His administration has declared war on affordable fossil energy and energy security. President Biden has already canceled the Keystone Pipeline and banned drilling on federal lands. Now Democrats are proposing this resolution to clear the pathway for President Biden and the EPA to impose burdensome new regulations on the energy industry. This is just the tip of the iceberg to regulate other sources under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, regardless of their overall contribution to air pollution. I would submit, ladies and gentlemen, we should be focusing on results, not on feel-good measures. This is an attack on American energy. Who's next? EPA has its crosshairs on the backbone of American industry: manufacturing, paper, chemicals, plastics, and metals. Millions of good-paying American jobs are on the line. Our competitiveness is on the line. American leadership is on the line. Our national security is on the line. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this harmful resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will yield now such time as she may consume to your neighbor in the great state of Colorado, who's the prime sponsor of this legislation, Ms. DeGette.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to my wonderful chairman, Frank Pallone, for recognizing me. Along with Mr. Peters and Mr. Lamb, I'm very proud to stand as the House sponsor, the companion of SJ Res 14, and I rise in strong support of the legislation. The purpose of the legislation is very simple. It's to reduce our methane emissions and to help stave off the worst effects of the climate crisis before it's too late. Methane, as we all know, is one of the most potent greenhouse gases on the planet, and when it's released into our atmosphere, it becomes a leading contributor of global warming. Climate experts agree that one of the most important things we can do right now to combat the climate crisis is to reduce the amount of methane in our atmosphere. And that's exactly what this legislation does. It restores the 2016 methane emission rules that were put into place during the Obama administration, and it negates the Trump administration's last-minute attempt to roll back these rules on its way out the door. 1/3 of all of the methane that's released in this country comes from the production of oil and gas. This legislation will once again require our oil and gas producers to take the steps needed to reduce the methane emitting from their drilling sites. These emissions don't just harm our planet. When methane is released from oil and gas sites, it's often accompanied by other pollutants that are known to cause additional harm to people's health. And that's why this legislation is so important, and that's why the Trump administration's egregious attempt to eliminate these important rules and let oil and gas companies release more methane from their drilling sites was met with such outrage and fury by citizens across this country. And you know something? Not just from the citizens, but from the biggest oil and gas companies in the country, including Exxon, Shell, BP, and more, and also from smaller producers around the country. These are the companies that stand to benefit most from the rollback of the methane rules, and even these are against it. So when I hear the ranking member talking about how we are going to be on the backs of oil and gas companies, the very companies she's talking about support this legislation today. And I just want to read a few of the names of the companies, large and small, that support the rollback of the Trump administration's methane rule and the reinstatement of the Obama-era rule. BP America, Shell US, Equinor North America, Total USA, ExxonMobil, Jonah Industry, Pioneer Natural Resources, EQT Corporation, Interstate Natural Gas Association of America, Cheniere, DTE Energy, Equitrans Midstream Corporation, Occidental Petroleum, Devon Energy, Edison Electric Institute, which is a consortium of groups, Center for Liquefied Natural Gas, Austin Energy, Calpine Corporation, Pacific Gas and Energy Company, Tenaska Inc., and others have all submitted comments, and the comments they have submitted are in support of SJ Res 14 and the rollback of the Trump administration's egregious rule. So when my colleagues on the other side say this is going to hurt oil and gas, the very companies they're talking about support this because the Trump administration's rule was so extreme and egregious. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a summary of the quotes in support of this legislation from these companies, a letter from BP, a letter from Occidental, and a letter from Equinor.
Without objection.
I thank the Speaker. And I will just say, if we don't act now, and if we let this rule stand, it is going to increase methane emissions in this country by nearly 1.6 tons by 2025. It will also result in a release of an additional 1.8 million tons of volatile organic compounds and more than 16,000 tons of hazardous air pollutants right into the air that we breathe. If we're going to get serious about addressing the climate change or the climate crisis, let's get serious about cutting our methane emissions. If we're going to get serious about protecting the public's health, let's pass this legislation today. I urge my colleagues to all support this important bill that has widespread support, not just from environmentalists, not just from the public, but from the oil industry itself. Let's do what the people have elected us to do. Let's put their health and safety and the health and safety of our planet above all else. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on SJ Res 14, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to SJ Res 14, which would increase the cost of energy for consumers and result in the loss of good-paying American jobs in our energy and manufacturing sectors. My district in Northwest and West Central Ohio is home to over 60,000 manufacturing jobs, with thousands more to come with recent announcements made in the past few weeks. One of the key factors that businesses consider when they make decisions about expanding or relocating is their ability to keep energy costs down while still being able to maintain profitable operations. Because of the American energy renaissance, fueled by lower domestic oil and natural gas production costs and the Trump administration's common sense regulatory approach, we have seen more companies come or return to the United States and bring with them high-paying quality jobs to our communities. My fear is that by returning to the Obama's EPA standards, we will be reasserting an outdated and burdensome regulatory regime that will sacrifice all the gains we have made in building up Americans' manufacturing sector. If the argument is about addressing climate change, then we really need to acknowledge the fact that the United States has been a global leader in emissions reduction since 2005. Since that time, emissions have fallen by more than 20% on a per capita basis. We should be focusing on innovative solutions and not accelerating the promulgation of cumbersome or duplicative regulations. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to oppose SJ Resolution 14, and I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield now 4 minutes to a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, strong environmentalist, a gentleman from California.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. And I'm here to speak in favor of SJ Res 14, a resolution I co-led with Representatives DeGette and Lamb. We need to address methane emissions for several reasons, and today I just want to mention 3. First, controlling methane is the single most important immediate step we can take to combat climate change, and that's because methane is a super pollutant responsible for about 25% of the man-made warming we experience today. This is the low-hanging fruit in climate mitigation. My Republican colleagues never miss a chance, and you'll hear this today, to point out that the natural gas revolution has contributed to our historic energy independence and cut our carbon dioxide emissions from energy productions, and that is right, but there's still a problem, and that problem is fugitive methane emissions. While burning natural gas can lower CO2 emissions by as much as 40 to 50% versus burning coal, almost all of that benefit from a climate change perspective is wiped out, even with small leaks of methane, which we have today. Put simply, to reap the climate benefits of natural gas, which are often touted, we have to address methane emissions. Second, controlling methane is critical to the economic competitiveness of the U.S. natural gas industry. And we should say thanks to the oil and gas industry when they do the right thing, but let's not fool ourselves that they're doing this because they're altruists. They're doing this because this is important to competitiveness. They're doing this because this makes American oil and gas more competitive. The reason is that world markets and domestic politics will not tolerate natural gas as a so-called bridge fuel unless the industry can prove with real credibility and transparency that it has fixed its methane problem. It's increasingly apparent that the viability of exporting U.S. liquefied natural gas, or LNG, depends on American policies to address methane pollution. 3 of the largest LNG importers in the world, South Korea, Japan, and the European Union, have set goals to reduce emissions to net zero by mid-century. These nations will demand verifiably clean gas from the United States. On top of this, investors are increasingly putting pressure on financial institutions and demanding climate-smart investment portfolios. Natural gas will solely be seen as a climate risk and not as a climate opportunity if methane leaks persist. We saw this recently in the cancellation by France of a deal for liquefied natural gas from Brownsville, $7 billion over 20 years. Ultimately, they were able to put that back together, but this is a sign of what's to come. If we don't get it right here, it's going to hurt business. And they all sounded like businesses to me that Ms. DeGette talked about. I'm not from Texas or Oklahoma, but I've heard of Exxon, and I've heard of the American Petroleum Institute. And if they're for it, it says something about where business is, what they think is about competitiveness. And third, U.S. companies can lead the world in developing technologies to monitor and reduce methane emissions. Climate change, dealing with climate change, is it's a science project. It's not a jobs program, but it does create a lot of jobs. 75% of the manufacturing firms and 88% of service firms in the sector report that they would create more jobs if the natural methane standards were reinstated. And the starting salary for methane mitigation jobs is nearly 10% higher than the national average salary and can pay up to $140,000 a year. These companies represent the best of American innovation, creating economic opportunity and tackling global challenges at the same time. Today, we in Congress can soundly reject one of the most irresponsible environmental rollbacks of the prior administration. We can restore robust methane pollution standards, and we can clear a path for stronger protections in the future. I'm proud to be a co-lead on the resolution. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes. This is a win-win-win for climate, public health, and U.S. industry, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my colleague, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to this harmful methane resolution. It's just another example of this majority and this administration's ever-changing support our global competitors at the expense of America's workers' energy narrative. They say they don't want to ban hydraulic fracturing, interfere with American energy dominance, or increase supply chain dependence on China. But with their renewed Obama-era regulations, the cancellation of America's pipeline projects, and proposed bans on domestic plastics manufacturing, it's clear they have an ulterior energy plan that might as well have been written in Moscow or Beijing. And the American taxpayer is footing the bill. As oil and gas prices rise with our country reopening from the pandemic, there should be an increase in new wells being drilled and rigs being brought online to meet demand, but reports suggest this is not the case. Under pressure from radical environmentalists coupled with the risks of an uncertain regulatory environment, American oil and gas producers are reducing drilling investments, costing jobs and increasing the likelihood of continued price spikes at the pump and at the grocery store. And while Democrats continue their assault on America's hard-earned global energy dominance, our adversaries have positioned themselves to take advantage of America's absence at the leadership table, while also making a profit. In just the latest example, President Biden lifted sanctions on the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, Putin's pipeline, which will be operational soon, sending Russian gas to Europe and billions into Putin's pocket. While he lifts sanctions on the Russians here at home, the president is, in effect, imposing sanctions on America's energy workers, all without Russia or China having to lift a finger. America's energy security, in effect, our national security, cannot depend on President Biden's weak leadership any longer. Mr. Speaker, you can just add this methane resolution to the long list of President Biden's predictably terrible policy solutions. Not only are we better than
Gentleman's
this,
time has expired.
we are smarter than this. I urge my colleagues to oppose this measure.
Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we'll reserve. You can go again.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
This CRA is another act by the Biden administration to undercut American energy production. It's plain and simple. In committee, I offered an amendment to this resolution which would simply express Congress's disapproval for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would bring Russian gas to Europe. Now, for the entire Trump administration, Democrats were obsessed with imagined Russian influence over his policies, repeatedly calling him a Russian agent. If Trump had waived sanctions on a Russian company and a friend of Vladimir Putin, like President Biden just did, there would be an immediate call for an investigation. You guys would probably try to impeach him again. President Biden just killed the Keystone Pipeline and continues to hamstring domestic producers, particularly smaller producers, killing American jobs, American energy production. It's truly baffling and illogical to me that he's willing to greenlight Russian energy projects while he kills American projects and kills American jobs. You know, the irony is that these energy-destroying policies actually have a negative impact on the environment. Think about this. Russian natural gas exported to Europe has a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions profile that's 41% higher than American LNG exported to Europe. 41% higher. And if Europe were to switch from the dirtier Russian gas to clean-burning U.S. natural gas through LNG exports, global emissions would actually go down by 70 million tons each year, 70 million tons. The United States is the #1 oil and gas producer in the world. But we also lead the world in emissions reduction, something y'all don't want to acknowledge. Putin would love nothing more than for America to be energy dependent, and President Biden is helping him achieve this goal, and Vladimir Putin is laughing. I urge my colleagues to defend American energy production and vote against this resolution, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 4 minutes now to one of the chief sponsors of the legislation, Mr. Lamb of Pennsylvania.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I rise today in support of this bill and would like to point out to my colleagues and anyone watching at home that I actually think today the difference is not really between business and labor. It's not between regulation and non-regulation. It's really not even between Democrats and Republicans. I think what separates supporters of today's bill from its detractors are those who are thinking in the long term versus those who are thinking in the short term. In the long term, climate change truly is a threat to American national security. And the Marine Corps in which I served has already had to consider whether it would move some of its historic bases, including Parris Island, perhaps the soul of the Marine Corps, simply due to sea level rise. The number of $1 billion catastrophic events in our country last year was 22. The average is 7 over the last 40-year period. This is getting more expensive and more dangerous every year. And in the long term, businesses that have to compete for capital and compete for market share in markets all around the world understand this, that this is our world now, that decarbonization is an absolute requirement to compete successfully, both as the United States and both as an individual business in the world that we're going into. The businesses that are thinking long-term have already taken steps to do this, and the businesses that are thinking short-term are pointing to the cost and the drawbacks and the requirement, all of which are real. None of us stand here today to casually make anything different or more difficult on an American company that's trying to preserve jobs and succeed in this economy, but there are some things we just have to do. And so, to use the words of an executive at Southwestern Energy Company, what some in the industry do not get is that we are transitioning to a low-carbon economy. We do need to show the climate benefit of our product. Or you could take the word of the American chairwoman and president of BP. We have to reduce methane emissions for natural gas to realize its full potential. And in my own hometown of Pittsburgh, we're happy to have headquartered the largest producer of natural gas in the United States, EQT. And even though under the Trump administration, the EPA head came to Pittsburgh to announce this absurd rollback of a rule that's good for business and good for the environment, EQT's president and CEO just 2 days ago said that tackling methane represents an opportunity for the United States because our natural gas, American natural gas, can become the decarbonizing commodity of choice. And so I've heard some of my friends on the other side point out that, yes, the United States has done quite a lot already to reduce emissions and is doing more. And not all of our competitors, like Russia and China, are doing the same. That's okay. Our market opportunity will come from attracting business in among our allies, South Korea, Japan, the European Union. And if you just picture now a politics of the near future where the European Union is placing carbon tariffs on every product that comes in or out, lower carbon American LNG will simply outcompete Russian products or Iranian products or any other product. That's the world that we live in now, and that's what it will mean for us to compete. Today's bill is about one thing and one thing only: the national interest of the United States. I urge all of my colleagues to support it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Latta. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this resolution. America's oil and gas industry is truly the backbone of the American economy, supporting 10 million jobs and contributing to billions of dollars of economic development in all 50 states. The energy industry is critical to our economic and national security, providing low and stable energy prices to American families and ensuring our independence from the Middle East and Russia. Despite these essential contributions, Democrats here are attempting to strap the industry with duplicative and unnecessary regulations. This resolution will contribute to American job losses and higher energy costs for American consumers, right on their energy bills. So, I want to say that this will also not reduce worldwide emissions. And the reason is because China is building coal-fired power plants at a rate that outpaces the rest of the world combined. So what we are doing here with not only this resolution, but the other policies that my friends on the other side of the aisle are pushing, is we are actually hurting America, losing American jobs, giving up our energy independence, so we're reliant on China and Russia and the Middle East. Why in the world would we do that? Mr. Lamb said this is for America. I totally disagree. This will hurt America, and this bill will help China and Russia. I oppose this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask how much time remains on each side?
The gentleman from New Jersey has 13 and a half minutes remaining. The gentleman from Ohio has 18 and a half minutes.
I think I'll
18 minutes remaining.
reserve, and you want to go next again?
Gentleman from New Jersey reserved. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield 2 minutes from the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pence.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to implore this governing body to consider the consequences of using the Congressional Review Act as a vehicle to reinstate the harmful Obama-era regulations on methane emissions. American energy independence is key to the economic and national security of Hoosiers and, of course, all Americans. These unnecessary and redundant regulations on new methane emissions will stifle responsible energy development and undercut our domestic energy potential. Because of the additional federal regulations this would create, Hoosiers will pay more to heat their homes and to cook their meals, which we're already seeing right now. As a veteran of the petroleum industry, I know that free market innovation has always been the key driver to developing more cost-effective and environmentally friendly uses of natural gas. Let's keep doing that. The burdensome regulations like the one before us today have never been the answer to improve our environment. I came to Washington to protect Hoosiers' way of life back home in the 6th District, and that's why I will continue to advocate for an all-of-the-above, not everything-but approach to energy. I urge my colleagues to oppose this attempt to cripple American energy, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
It's now to the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Leisure Fernandez, who also represents one of my favorite places, Santa Fe.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do welcome everybody in this chamber to New Mexico, which is indeed one of those beautiful places that I get to call home. But you know what? New Mexico, my beautiful place I call home, is also ground zero for the climate crisis. The West is experiencing a devastating drought coupled with damaging wildfires, and these are caused undoubtedly by the climate crisis we are experiencing. My beautiful state is also home to both the Permian and the San Juan basins. And because of that, we also have some of the highest levels of methane pollution. We also have some of the highest levels of asthma rates among our beautiful children. And every bit of methane that is released is wasted. It is wasted. It is a valuable resource that is released into the air through methane venting, through flaring, and simply because they have not maintained their sites. But methane that is released and flared and leaked is also a resource upon which my state cannot collect severance taxes, upon which my state cannot collect royalties. And so when that methane is leaked and flared and vented, those same children who are suffering from those high asthma rates, they lose the resources that should go into our public education. So I will say that my state, which needs every little nickel and dime because we are a poor state and which relies on those oil and gas revenues, what did we do? We recently enacted some of our own rules to curb methane emission from oil and gas activity, and these rules are now considered to be the best in the country. If New Mexico can lead the way, we can follow it here in Congress, because taking action at the federal level is reasonable. It's common sense. As Don Schreiber, one of my constituents and a rancher in New Mexico who has those wells on his site, says, New Mexicans built our oil and gas infrastructure, and these same communities can now design, manufacture, and install the technology to monitor and prevent methane emissions. Because you know what? Regulation spurs innovation, and we are looking forward to that innovation and those good jobs that will come from the methane regulation that we will have now when we overturn this rule. I'd like to thank my good friend, Senator Heinrich, for introducing and advancing this legislation in the Senate, and my great colleagues here, Representatives DeGette, Lamb, and Pallone, for advancing and championing the cause of my wonderful children and students and state here on this rule. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Joyce.
Is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, this partisan resolution is unnecessary for a number of reasons. At its core, this is a solution that is looking for a problem. The oil industry already is voluntarily reducing methane emissions, and the United States has led the world in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the last 2 decades. Innovation is the ultimate answer to cutting emissions. We cannot afford to stifle advancement. As a nation, we cannot regulate our way to a cleaner environment. Most importantly, new methane regulations are duplicative of existing federal and state regulations under the Clean Air Act for volatile organic compounds known as VOCs. The EPA determined in an earlier rulemaking that rescinding the methane limits will not actually change the amount of methane emission reductions. This solution is not about methane emissions or climate change. The truth is that we already regulate methane. The EPA and the states have strong standards in place for volatile organic compounds and methane. The existing standards and pollution control equipment installed at oil and gas facilities help to manage both methane and VOCs because they are both produced from the same source and have a similar chemistry and behavior. The real intent of this misguided resolution is simple. The oil and gas sector is just the tip of the iceberg. The purpose is to give the EPA authority to use Section 111 of the Clean Air Act to regulate every other sector of our economy. Congress must continue to embrace the bottom-up innovation that will result in leaps in efficiency far greater than any mandate, instead of expensive overregulation that will take money out of working Americans' pockets. As a nation, we can do better. As a Congress, we must do better. I urge my colleagues to join me in voting no on this resolution. Thank you, and I yield.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll continue to reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Armstrong.
The gentleman is recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning.
You can put American behind Equinor. It doesn't make it an American company. It's a Norwegian company that used to be called Statoil, now is called Equinor, that has American operations. You can put American behind Shell. It doesn't make it an American company. It's a Dutch company who has its own legal problems in its own court that has American operations. I appreciate both of them. At times they've done business in North Dakota. They've been great corporate citizens. You can talk about Exxon and you can talk about BP, you can talk about Shell. But let's be careful when we talk about all companies, big and small, that support this industry. Because the one caveat with all of these companies, and this is true, the vast majority of their production does not occur onshore and most often does not even occur in the United States. And so what does that mean? They're not subject to this CRA. Small and medium-sized gas companies do not support this regulation. North Dakota oil and gas companies do not support this regulation. And it's not because they're interested in polluting, it's because they don't want to be duplicatively regulated from the wellhead to the market. States are already doing this. We've heard this from New Mexico. North Dakota is regulating this. We have our industrial commission, we have our DEQ. But the real problem with this EPA regulation and these Obama-era policies coming back is not only is it duplicative regulation, but it actually stifles innovation. Because the one thing state regulators can do significantly better than the federal government is respond quickly, adapt. So when an industry comes to you and says, hey, I have a way to do this better, they will work with you, they'll get it done. We see it happen every single day in the oil patch in western North Dakota. The problem is federal regulation at its very core is unwieldy, it's unburdensome, and it gives a tremendous market share advantage to large companies over smaller companies. We need to stop duplicative regulation. We need to allow companies to regulate, industries to regulate, and states to innovate and regulate. And we know this because we've heard it a lot. If the market is demanding, companies are going to do it. Why need the burdensome federal regulation? And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll now recognize Mr. Peters for such time as he may use.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to respond to a couple of things I heard. One is this tip of the iceberg idea that we're doing something beyond methane by doing this. And of course, that's not how it works around here. The laws are specifically written around what we're doing. We're only voting on this, and I can tell you that if we were doing more than this, we might get a different response from the oil and gas industry than we've seen. That's not a real argument. The other thing is that this is somehow cooked up by the Biden administration and as a way to undercut oil and gas. And again, I want to go through all the names that Ms. DeGette went through of the companies and organizations that support this regulation. But it's hard to argue that the American Petroleum Institute is anything other than American. It's also hard to argue, even with a company that's based someplace else, that they would be arguing to burden, so as it's characterized, their United States operations with these regulations. There would be no incentive for them to do that, no matter where the corporate headquarters was based. The fact is that these companies see this as a way to be competitive. And it's not unprecedented. One thing we did on the committee last term that became part of the year-end spending plan was the American Innovation and Manufacturers Act, which regulated HFCs. And if you recall, the industry supported the institution of standards around HFCs so that it could compete successfully with manufacturers around the world who were competing on or building to the same standards. It was actually helpful for them to have a uniform standard that they could innovate around. And that's why Republicans and Democrats supported that. It became part of a bipartisan end of the year package. We're in the same situation here where business is saying, set a standard here. Don't tell us that we're going to get one set of regulations, by the way, in Colorado and virtually no regulations in Texas. That's not, we're not being duplicative at all. What we're doing is setting a standard. Let's set a federal standard. Let's do it at the request of the industry and with the cooperation of the industry to make sure we get it right. And I guess the other remarkable thing that's implied by all of this discussion is that we're talking about regulating methane out of oil and gas production. No one's talking about banning oil and gas. We wouldn't have to be talking about methane at all if we were talking about that. In fact, we're trying to take oil and gas and get it right, to get it competitive and get it to be climate friendly for our future generations. So I thought that the one glaring omission from my colleagues' arguments is how do you explain so much support from American oil and gas companies for this regulation? I wouldn't suggest that it's unanimous. I would say probably it's not. But to dismiss it is really, I think, really missing the point. And I think it's obvious that this industry sees this as an advantage in terms of competitiveness going forward, as Mr. Lamb said as well. So with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to my friend from Minnesota, Representative Stauber.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong opposition to this Congressional Review Act resolution, which would nullify a rule put in place by President Trump that contributed to our American energy dominance. Unfortunately for Democrats, this misguided solution in search of a non-existent problem trades American livelihoods for radical activist priorities. The United States leads the world in emissions reductions thanks to the natural gas revolution. Our emissions declined significantly over the last few decades, while natural gas production spiked by more than 50%, proving that renewable resources like natural gas provide a clean, low-cost energy alternative. This CRA will only limit our domestic supply and force us to look abroad once again, empowering OPEC and Russia to determine the price of living our daily lives. As the ranking member of Energy and Minerals Resources, I know that our domestic energy producers are the best in the world. With many being small business owners, they are a testament to American innovation as they deliver us low-cost energy while reducing emissions. We need to return to American Energy First policies that empower our workers and American innovation, and not failed policies that hand the keys over to our rivals. Therefore, I urge a no vote on this resolution.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to my colleague, Representative Harrell from New Mexico.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise also in strong opposition to this resolution, as is yet another attempt by my Democratic colleagues to nickel and dime the most essential industry in my district out of business. The energy policies of the Biden administration have been a complete and utter disaster. American jobs are being lost, and gas prices are soaring due to a retreat from the policies of the Trump administration that created American energy dominance. Small and mid-sized oil and gas producers employ tens of thousands of New Mexicans and contribute millions of dollars in revenues to my state's budget. These essential businesses are the ones that will be most negatively impacted by the passage of this resolution. Small and mid-sized producers are already under attack by the ban of the new oil and gas leases on federal lands put in place by this administration, which just last week a federal judge ruled to be illegal. Instead of approving foreign pipelines and implementing duplicative and costly regulations which strengthen the hands of our enemies, this administration and this House should be focused on creating jobs here at home and lowering energy costs for all Americans. I and many other of my Republican colleagues have put forward common sense pieces of legislation to ensure economic and environmental sustainability for our constituents. This legislation does just the opposite. I ask my colleagues to oppose this legislation and to join us on this side of the aisle in fighting to continue the American energy dominance agenda of the previous administration that resulted in a cleaner environment and a vibrant economy. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlewoman yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield now such time as she may consume again to the gentlewoman from New Mexico, Ms. Leisure Fernandez.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I would also like to bring to this body's attention that this resolution will actually put New Mexico on the same playing field as the rest of the country, because as I noted earlier, New Mexico has now adopted some of the strictest methane regulations in the country, and those regulations, similar to what we are seeing now, were adopted in consultation and with the support of many in the oil and gas industry who participated in a rulemaking, who recognize that it is in their best interest to operate in a manner that is safe, in a manner that does not lose this precious resource. And that's how we came to our regulations in New Mexico. But we are at a disadvantage in New Mexico because, as it was noted earlier, that if some states have nice, good regulations with regards to methane emissions and others don't, then in the Permian Basin, for example, what would stop a company to say, I'm going to drill in Texas and not in New Mexico, because they are protecting our environment in New Mexico. So what I look forward to seeing is having New Mexico be at the same place as the rest of the country so that we are not losing our drilling to Texas, who doesn't have it. I like the idea of everybody has the same set of rules. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would like now to yield 2 minutes to my friend, Representative Arrington from the great state of Texas.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My friend from Pennsylvania, I oppose this resolution, Mr. Speaker. I think it is in a long line of attacks from a hostile administration and some of my Democrat colleagues against oil and gas, conventional fuels, which has blessed our country with a safe, affordable, abundant supply of energy. It fuels our economy, keeps energy costs low for consumers and working families, and it gives us energy independence. And this, in addition to the Paris climate and millions of jobs going away in the future as we implement that, pipeline and critical infrastructure cancellations, public land drilling moratoriums, weaponizing the tax code, because that's what's next, as they do away with ordinary and necessary depreciation and general business expenses. The posture from my colleagues is hostility towards an industry that has been so good to this country and to working families. In this case, we would go back to the Obama-era regulatory regime that is costly and burdensome, not to the multinational oil and gas companies. They welcome it because they'll just increase their market share. It's the mom and pop small business independent producers. They make up 85% of the production of oil and gas. They can't take this. They will shut their doors. We will shutter family-owned small businesses. And for what? Trace amounts of methane gas. The cost benefit does not make any sense. This is a sledgehammer to a fly approach. The real emitters on methane gas, if that's your goal, downstream, large-scale, industrial, utilities, and other industrial operations. That's where we ought to focus. That's what the Trump administration focused on. Gave room for innovation, respected state regulation, and that partnership and federalism. That's my position, Mr. Speaker. I implore my colleagues to join me in opposing this and get back to some reasonable approaches to stewarding our environment and economic growth.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I again inquire about the amount of time on each side?
The gentleman from New Jersey has 6 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Pennsylvania has 7 minutes remaining.
Does the gentleman have additional speakers?
Just one.
Okay, well then I'll reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd now like to yield 2 minutes to Mr. Pfluger, again from the great state of Texas.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today vehemently opposed to the Democrats' latest move in their war on American energy independence. Today's misguided resolution calling for additional onerous regulations from the Obama administration era to be reimposed on the fossil fuel industry will only lead to a lack of energy security. Just 2 years ago, the United States became the #1 producer of oil and natural gas in the world, thanks to President Trump's administration's deregulation that allowed private energy innovators and entrepreneurs to flourish. I represent the Permian Basin, and let me just state for the record that Texas does have methane regulations, a completely false accusation that I've heard 3 times in this debate. Energy security is national security. And now we risk losing our competitive edge on the world stage with needless regulations that will hurt small and independent producers and crush innovation. The same private innovation that has allowed the United States to lead the way in reducing methane emissions to a 20-year low. Mr. Speaker, our nation relies on affordable, reliable energy. The same affordable, reliable energy that has raised 1 billion people out of poverty in the last 10 years, 1 billion people out of poverty. And today, global demand is going to continue to increase. We cannot allow foreign adversaries like China and Russia and others to profit off of our overly regulated state. Let me say again, energy security is national security. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this resolution and standing up for American energy independence. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm prepared to close if you are.
Yes, sir.
I reserve then.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is just the tip of the iceberg. EPA will use the resolution to clear the way for other sources without formally establishing that a pollutant significantly contributes to harmful air pollution as a predicate for new regulations. Manufacturing paper, plastics, metals, and virtually every other industry in America certainly could be next. In conclusion, we must not allow overregulation to crush the energy jobs that America wants and America needs. Thank you, and I yield.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it is quickly becoming clear that the greatest potential to curb methane and thus climate change in the next decade is in the fossil fuel sector. The UN Environmental Program and the Climate and Clean Air Coalition published the Global Methane Assessment just last month, and they found that first, fast and ambitious methane mitigation is one of the best strategies available today to deliver immediate and long-lasting benefits for climate, agriculture, human, and ecosystem health. They also found that rapid and dramatic methane pollution cuts could both slow global warming and prevent 250,000 deaths every year. And also that reduction measures used to curb methane from the oil and gas sector would cost the least, or in some cases even have negative costs, as captured methane can be resold for revenue in the oil and gas sector. These relatively inexpensive methane reduction measures are possible with currently available technology, like fixing leaks in gas pipelines and stopping venting in gas drilling. So these findings support what many already know to be true, that ambitiously addressing methane pollution can yield tremendous climate, public health, and financial, and I stress, and financial benefits across the economy. And this is why we see most of the oil and gas companies supporting this resolution. Disapproving a rule that would lead to an increase in methane pollution and reinstating the 2016 rule's common sense, cost-effective safeguards should be an easy yes vote. And for that reason, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. All time for debate has now expired. Pursuant to the rule, the previous question is ordered on the joint resolution. The question is on third reading of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Joint resolution provided for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code of the rules submitted by the Environmental Protection Agency relating to oil and natural gas sector emission standards for new reconstruction and modified sources review.
The question is on passage of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The joint resolution is passed, and without objection.
I would ask for the ayes and nays, a recorded vote.
Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Section 3, subparagraph S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Yep. For what purpose does the distinguished gentleman from the state of California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Rice of New York pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Ms. Rice will vote yes on SJ Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Joe Wilson pursuant to House Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Wilson will vote nay.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Kirkpatrick pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Ms. Kirkpatrick will vote yes on SJ Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Hoyer of Maryland pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House Mr. Hoyer will vote yes on SJ Res 14.
For what purpose does the distinguished gentlewoman from the state of Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Sewell pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Ms. Sewell will vote yes on SJ Res 14. And as the member designated by Ms. Strickland pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Ms. Strickland will vote yes on SJ Res 14.
Okay. For what purpose does the distinguished chairman from the state of New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Donald Payne pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Payne will vote yes on SJ Res 14. And as the member designated by Mr. Donald Norcross pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Norcross will vote yes on SJ Res 14. And as the member designated by Mr. Albio Series pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Series will vote yes on SJ Res 14.
For what purpose does the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
The Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Van Drew pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Van Drew will vote yes.
For what purpose does the honorable conference chairman seek recognition?
The member designated by Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Chairwoman Johnson will vote yea on SJ Res 14. The member designated by Chairwoman Nydia Velasquez pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Chairwoman Velasquez will vote yea on SJ Res 14.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, I was doing that intentionally. Give me a hard time. For what purpose does the distinguished gentlewoman from the state of Connecticut seek recognition?
As the member designated by Ms. Wilson pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Ms. Wilson will vote yes on SJ Res 14.
Oh. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Miller of West Virginia pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Ms. Miller will vote no on S.J. Res 14. And as the member designated by Mr. Buchanan of Florida pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform that the House that Mr. Buchanan will vote no on S.J. Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. DeSagne pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. DeSagne will vote yes on S.J. Res. 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
As a member designated by Mr. Vella pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Vella will vote aye on S.J. Res. 14. As a member designated by Mr. Swalwell pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Swalwell will vote aye on S.J. Res. 14.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Kansas seek recognition?
Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. DeFazio pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. DeFazio will vote yes on S.J. Res. 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Grijalva pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Grijalva will vote aye on S.J. Res. 14.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Congresswoman Escobar pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Escobar will vote yes on S.J. Res. 14.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Vesey of Texas pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Mr. Vesey will vote yes on S.J. Res. 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Ruiz pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Ruiz will vote yes on S.J. Res. 14.
But for what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Lawson of Florida, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Lawson will vote yes Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Wasserman Schultz pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Ms. Wasserman Schultz will vote yes on SJ Res 14. And as the member designated by Mr. Christ pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Christ will vote yes on SJ Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentle lady from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Castor pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Ms. Castor will vote yes on SJ Resolution 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. As the member designated by Mr. Amadei, Nevada, pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Amadei will vote nay on SJ Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a member designated by Mr. Swazi pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Swazi will vote aye on SJ Res 14. As a member designated by Mr. Gottheimer pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Gottheimer will vote aye on SJ Res 14. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentle lady from Illinois seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Rush pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Rush will vote yes on SJ Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentle lady from Massachusetts seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Himes pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Himes will vote yes on SJ Res 14. As the member designated by Mr. Pappas pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Mr. Pappas will vote yes on SJ Res 14. As the member designated by Ms. Frankel pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Ms. Frankel will vote yes on SJ Res 14. As a member designated by Ms. Custer pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Ms. Custer will vote yes on SJ Res 14. As the member designated by Ms. Meng pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Ms. Meng will vote yes on SJ Res 14. And as the member designated by Ms. Barragan pursuant to HRES 8, I inform the House that Ms. Barragan will vote yes on SJ Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Dr. Michael Burgess pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Dr. Burgess will vote nay.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? Oh, sorry, or Michigan, whichever you prefer.
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Tlaib of Michigan pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Tlaib will vote aye on S.J. Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Representative Jimenez of Florida pursuant to House Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Jimenez will vote no on Resolution 14. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
As the member designated by Mr. Torres pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. Torres will vote yes on S.J. Res 14.
Other side. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
As a member designated by Mr. McHenry of North Carolina pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Mr. McHenry will vote no on S.J. Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as member designated by Congressmember Napolitano pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Congressmember Napolitano will vote yes on S.J. Res 14. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Adderholt of Alabama pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Adderholt will vote no on S.J. Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Chairwoman Maxine Waters pursuant to House Resolution 8, I inform the House that Chairwoman Waters will vote yes on S.J. Resolution 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Young of the great state of Alaska, pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Young will vote nay on S.J. Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Lowenthal pursuant to H.Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Lowenthal will vote yes on H.J. Res 14. As the member designated by Mr. Liu pursuant to H.Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Liu will vote yes on H.J. Res 14.
New York seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Ms. Stefanik from New York, pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Stefanik will vote no on S.J. Res 14.
This is the gentle lady from Michigan seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mrs. Joyce Beatty pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Ms. Beatty will vote yes on S.J. Resolution 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Mullen of Oklahoma pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Mullen will vote nay on S.J. Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentle lady from Missouri seek recognition?
Can't hear.
Did I have a mic there? For what purpose does the gentle lady... What's that? For what purpose does the gentle lady from Missouri seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as a member designated by Mr. Graves from Missouri pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Graves will vote nay on S.J. Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Mr. Reed of New York pursuant to H-Res 8, I inform the House that Mr. Reed will vote yea on S.J. Res 14.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, as the member designated by Ms. Titus of Nevada, pursuant to H.Res. 8, I inform the House that Ms. Titus will vote yea on S.J. Res. 14.
On this vote, the yeas are 229 and the nays are 191. The joint resolution is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
The House will be in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I asked to speak out of order, unanimous consent to speak out of order for the purpose of inquiring the floor schedule for next week to the House Majority Whip.
Without objection.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. I also ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
With that, I'd like to now yield to my friend, the gentleman from South Carolina and the House Majority Whip, Mr. Clyburn.
I thank the gentleman for yielding me the time. And Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker, the House is not in order.
Madam Speaker, the House is
The
not in
gentleman
order.
will suspend. The House will be in order. The gentleman may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding and appreciate him allowing me to once again stand in for the Majority Leader. I know he joins me in hoping that the Majority Leader will be back with us very shortly and that this will be his last time having to contend with me. But I hope that Mr. Hoyer will be rejoining us very soon as he continues to mend. Next week, the House will meet on Monday at 12 p.m. for a morning hour debate and at 2 p.m. for legislative business. with votes expected no later than 6:30 p.m. On Tuesday, the House will meet at 10 a.m. for morning hour debate and 12 p.m. for legislative business. On Wednesday, the House will meet at 12 p.m. for legislative business. On Thursday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. for legislative business. And on Friday, the House will meet at 9 a.m. For pro forma session. I'm sorry, at 11:30 for pro forma session. Now on Monday, we will consider several bills under suspension of the rules. The complete list of suspension bills will be announced by the close of business today. In addition, we will consider H.R. 3005, legislation to remove the bust of former Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney, Confederate statutes, and certain other statutes. H.R. 2662, the Inspectors General Independence and Empowerment Act. This legislation is sorely needed in the wake of the prior administration's assault on the rule of law and independent oversight. It would strengthen the independence of inspectors general and protect their ability to investigate abuses at federal agencies. A resolution to establish a select committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the Capitol. H.R. 3684 will be considered, the Invest in America Act, to grow our economy and create good jobs by modernizing our nation's roads, bridges, rail, and transit. In addition to addressing surface transportation, this bill will also include critical provisions to address our safe drinking water and wastewater infrastructure needs. With that, I'll yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. And as we look at some of the bills that are going to be coming to the floor next week, I know there's been a lot of talk about infrastructure. As we saw over these past few days, there's a bipartisan bill that's being worked through mostly in the Senate, where a number of Republicans and Democrats had seemed to reach an agreement on what would be considered traditional infrastructure without tax increases. It's now become a little more confused by this suggestion that maybe the Speaker has said it has to be tied to a budget reconciliation bill that would possibly raise taxes, which is not surely where we are. It doesn't seem to be where the bipartisan group in the Senate is. I would ask the gentleman, is there any expectation, because we don't have a budget that's moved through the House, and a budget would have to move first to create an ability for a budget reconciliation bill to move through the House or the Senate, if that even happened. Is there an expectation that would be a budget resolution coming to the floor in the upcoming weeks? And I would yield.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. I have not consulted with the majority leader on that subject. I suspect that we will await for the Senate's actions and make determinations as needed when we get some definition as to what they're going to do. I understand that the gentleman indicates that what has occurred regarding the bipartisan legislation is of concern, but I assure the gentleman that the President made it very clear from the beginning that he has a definition of infrastructure that goes into family needs and or more or less non-traditional. And I think that all that the Speaker has been talking about is to reinforce her beliefs that the President is correct in his thoughts.
And gentlemen,
I'll yield back.
You know, for over decades, we've never really had a disagreement on what infrastructure means. And I think most Americans would recognize with the definition that we've always gone by on a bipartisan basis, and it's roads and bridges and waterways, ports. I think recently both sides would agree that broadband is something that we would include in that definition, but that is what always was the traditional definition of infrastructure by both parties. It seems like on the majority side, they're trying to change that definition to include a lot of extraneous things, which were not part of the Senate bipartisan agreement. But the other new addition seems to be this idea that a shell reconciliation bill to raise taxes would now be something that would maybe hold hostage the rest of the bipartisan agreement. I hope that's not the road we go down, especially considering there does seem to be a lot of bipartisan movement on something that we would all agree is traditional infrastructure. And so I know the bill next week that's being brought to the House floor does not meet that bipartisan test of what senators and others that are trying to work together have reached agreement on. So hopefully this doesn't get bogged down in a fight on things that are not considered infrastructure, but I don't know if the gentleman has anything to add to it. I would hope we go down the road where both parties could come to an agreement and we could actually get something done, and I would yield.
Thank you for yielding. I don't know that I have any more to add to that except to say that if we go back into history, we've got to know that rail was not infrastructure until Abraham Lincoln decided that it should be. The interstate highways were not infrastructure until Dwight Eisenhower decided that it should be. And broadband has not been infrastructure until now. And I think that's because we are being more futuristic when we think about what the needs are going to be in this great country as we move forward. And so I'm glad that the gentleman agrees that broadband is, in fact, an infrastructure issue. A couple of years ago, I had a hard time getting people to understand that. But COVID-19 has revealed to us that there are things that we did not consider in the past, which we must consider going forward. Broadband is one of them. Family infrastructure needs or a few other things. And I'll yield back.
I appreciate that, and I hope as we look toward something that we could all agree on, that's the road we stay on, so to speak, as we talk about infrastructure, not extraneous things that we don't agree on. And clearly, we've looked at and agreed on things like broadband, and we've seen the FCC take good steps to continue to expand broadband, especially in rural areas where there is a true digital divide that we're trying to overcome. And I know Congress has come together many times in the last few years to try to put more money in place to bridge that gap on the digital divide. Still more work to do, and especially during the pandemic, we saw there are more needs. But if we can keep it focused on those things, I think you'll see a lot of bipartisan agreement. Once it gets beyond that, that's where things have seemed to break down. What I want to ask about something that's going to expire at the end of next week, and that is this proxy voting scheme that's been going on since May of last year. And from what the majority had presented when this got created was the reason that proxy voting was there is because we had a pandemic and things were shut down and people had trouble getting around and maybe were concerned about the virus and not wanting to leave maybe their home or their local community. Obviously now with a vaccine readily available for any American who wants to take it, with more states opening up, and you're seeing even here in Congress, many committees that were not having in-person hearings are now getting back to in-person hearings. So what I would ask the gentleman is when proxy voting expires on July 3rd, can we let Congress get back to the normal work and not renew proxy voting? Because as we've seen, there's a lot more cooperation, a lot more agreements you can reach when you're here in person working together that you just can't get on a Zoom or WebEx call, or just somebody staying at home proxy voting and not coming here to Washington when now everyone who wants to can come. And we've looked at what this has done. It's hurt the institution in our opinion. But there are 6 Democrats who since this got started last year, have never come to vote in person except for the vote for Speaker of the House, because that is a vote that you cannot cast by proxy. And so if they were able to get here for the vote for Speaker in January, yet on every other vote have not cast a single vote in person, then they're clear it's not because they have no ability to get to Washington. And it feels like there's an abuse of this proxy voting that's shown it needs to end. And I don't know if there's an expectation next week that the majority would renew this. We would urge strongly that we let it expire on July 3rd and then get back to the work that we do in person. And I would yield to the gentleman.
Thank you for yielding. I assure the gentleman that his concerns are well considered on this side of the aisle. Next week will be our last week before going into the Independence Day break, and I suspect some assessments will be made between now and our returning after the July 4th holidays. As you know, we've gone from 45 minutes down to 20 minutes now. I'm looking forward to us going to the regular 15 minutes now that people are gathering on the floor. And I would hope that between now and then, families, we want to be a family-friendly Congress, and families are reordering their businesses so that their children and other children can be accounted and taken care of as we return back to normal. Because these considerations are not just for us, but it's for what's happening back in communities and whether or not these communities are being stood up in such a way that child care can be available and other things that will keep families intact. But I assure you that we are concerned about getting back to regular order, and I look for that to occur hopefully soon after the July 4th holidays. Are you back?
I appreciate that, and hopefully we just let it expire. Clearly that's our hope, and we urge the majority to consider that, because if you look at voting, it is good that we're finally limiting the time so we can have a normal voting schedule, or at least get closer to that. But as we look at the appropriations process, for example, where appropriations bills will start moving out of committee in July, may start coming to the floor in July. As we know, if we have a robust, open process for appropriations bills, typically you might have 100 amendments on a given appropriations bill. And so many times we have late night votes. We have 2-minute votes, because if Congress is truly going to process those amendments in an orderly way, even 15-minute votes or 5-minute votes haven't worked. And so we went to a 2-minute voting schedule. You can't do that if we have proxy voting, because as the gentleman knows, it does eat up a lot more time and delays our ability to move through a normal appropriations process. So looking towards that, the July 3rd date is there. If it expires, as we hope it does, I think that would help Congress to more effectively work through some of the big bills that we have on our calendar ahead. So I know y'all will be considering that. I think the gentleman knows where we are and what we would hope happens. Do want to ask about some of the crises that we're seeing around the country. You look at inflation continuing to be a growing problem. We had in our committee, the Federal Reserve Chairman, Mr. Powell, just a few days ago talked about the concerns with 5% inflation. We continue to see, whether it's gasoline prices, double-digit increases, everything we buy at the grocery, you're starting to see larger increases in costs for grocery items, housing, if you're just trying to buy a house, to renovate your house, those costs are higher. If you want an appliance, you might have to wait 6 months. Much of that is because of the labor shortage. Every small business you talk to says the biggest impediment they have to getting their businesses back up again is that the federal government is paying people more money not to work than to go back to work. When you have millions of job openings, it doesn't seem to make sense that we're allowing people to be paid not to work when businesses are struggling to get back on their feet from this pandemic. So I don't know if there's an anticipation to bring legislation to start confronting some of those problems. Clearly, we see the Vice President at the border today. While she's not at the areas of the border where you see the biggest increases in illegal crossings, we know that there is a crisis in the United States. And it's not just people in South and Central America coming across. We're seeing people from Middle Eastern countries. There have been people on the terrorist watch list that are coming. I hope that as she comes back from that trip, hopefully she's met with Border Patrol agents, people that have told us what the problems are. The president could address all of this today by reversing some of his executive actions that have opened the border. But if he doesn't, I hope Congress would look at bringing legislation to confront a lot of those challenges that I talked about. And I'm not sure if y'all anticipate bringing bills like that, but would ask the gentleman if he had any comment on that. I would be happy to yield.
Well, thank you for yielding at the time. As you mentioned, we were honored this week with the presence of Chairman Powell at our Select Subcommittee hearing. Now, Chairman Powell made two things very clear to us. Number one, he says, it would be a big mistake to put the brakes on too soon, that we must allow families to get back on their feet, communities to get restored, and he advised against us doing anything too soon. He also made it very clear that if he were to, and the Fed were to make some determination that inflation was becoming a problem, you may recall he indicated that a lot of the price increases have come about as a result of bottlenecks that exist in the system as people are gearing back up. And he thinks that it's going to be temporary. He also feels that if it looks like it's going to go beyond being temporary, that he has the tools to make the kind of adjustments that are necessary to keep the economy flowing and to keep inflation in check. So I think that on my side of the aisle, we are very comfortable following the advice of Chairman Powell, and I would hope that this is an issue that will not get politicized. We need to get this country back on track. We need to get families back in touch with each other. We need to keep this country moving in a positive way. So I think we're going to wait and take advice from Chairman Powell on whether we should do anything legislatively to deal with that issue. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and as we know, the Federal Reserve Chairman has some tools available to him, if need be, to address problems in the economy that we're starting to see, but we also know that those tools are very harsh. Hopefully those tools would be a last resort, and so it's important for us as policymakers to not just sit back and wait for problems to occur that then the Federal Reserve Chairman has to address, because we haven't, because we know if he does those things, whether it's limiting money supply, interest rate increases, those are all things that would hurt hardworking families all across the country. And so as he even recognized, right now, the enhanced unemployment benefits that are, by all accounts, the reason that we're having a worker shortage, the reason that every small business is having trouble getting more people back to work so they can meet that supply demand that's starting to create inflation. He did acknowledge that when those enhanced benefits run out, then you'll see the worker shortage get better and improve and people start going back to work. We could end those earlier, acknowledging their millions of job openings. We shouldn't be paying people money to not work when there are jobs that are available right now and they can't find takers. What we've seen is a majority of states now have said we're going to end those benefits on our own so that people can get back to work, so that we can get our economies moving. Many large states, Florida, Texas, next week, Tennessee, I think, many other states, by the end of next week will do that. I'm proud that my state, yesterday, our governor, who's a Democrat, signed a bill working with Republicans to end our enhanced unemployment benefits in Louisiana by the end of July. He acknowledged, as a Democrat, that you can work together, and this is a problem, and let's address this problem. While states are addressing it, some are not, many have, but hopefully Congress can look at ways where we can address some of these problems earlier so that it doesn't fall in the lap of the Federal Reserve Chairman, and then he has to take harsh steps to deal with the problems that we should be fixing as we see them coming. If the gentleman has anything else, that's all I have.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. I assure you that in my instance, my governor is a Republican. In fact, he was the first governor to endorse the previous president. But we are very close friends, and we have been in consultation over what to do as we go forward. I am working very closely with him and working very closely with other governors as well. And I think that each state is unique when it comes to how to stand back up as we go forward. I am proud that Louisiana is moving in the right direction. I applaud John Bell Edwards for working closely with you. I assure you that I'm working just as close with the governor of South Carolina and other governors to make sure that we do what is necessary to apply our efforts in such a way that it won't cause problems for states as they stand back up. Are you back?
I appreciate that because, you know, as I work well with our governor, we might not see eye to eye on everything, but Governor John Bell Edwards is, I think, addressing those problems adequately. He worked with the Republican legislature, and they got an agreement, and it was a good agreement. I know you have a good relationship with your governor. You and I have a good relationship, and hopefully we can use those good relationships to prove people wrong who look at Congress and say, why can't they get agreements on things? We're seeing some positive movement on the Senate side. Haven't seen the details, and the details are very, very important, but hopefully on these big issues, we can work together and build those relationships so that we can actually solve these problems and solve them in a way that it doesn't harm families where it could end up in a harsh place if we don't confront those problems. So I know we'll be talking more about that in the future.
Sure.
If the gentleman is not the one doing the colloquy in the future, we hope the majority leader is back. I've enjoyed this with you. We obviously enjoy our relationship on many fronts, but it's been a pleasure to work with you on the colloquy. Hopefully the majority leader's here next time, and he's got big shoes to fill, but I would yield back to the gentleman.
Well, thank you so much for yielding, and thank you so much for your friendship, and thanks so much for being so kind with your remarks today. But I am looking forward to the majority leader coming back and taking his rightful place at this mic, and you and I can continue our relationship with the Select Subcommittee and in other areas around the Capitol. Thank you so much.
Thank you. He'll probably be moving around even faster. I will not challenge him to a race. I'm not quite where he is yet, but working to get there. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent of the House to speak for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Nearly 40% of Americans before COVID couldn't cover an unexpected $400 expense without selling belongings or going into debt. And no one pays a greater price for poverty than our kids. I am proud of our work to pass the American Rescue Plan and deliver a lifeline for millions of struggling Americans. And starting July 15th, that lifeline gets stronger. In a few weeks, and again every month throughout 2021, hardworking families will get a check of up to $300 per child. That check will help millions of parents buy healthy food, new clothes, shoes, and books for their kids, pay rent and utilities, and even afford childcare so they can get back to work. In my own home district in New York's Capital Region, these checks will reach more than 37,000 households and help lift more than 5,000 of our kids out of poverty. These are not just lasting investments in America's recovery, they are the down payment on our brightest future. I urge every parent and family that has struggled to make ends meet during this pandemic to visit childtaxcredit.gov and make certain that you're signed up. With that, I thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, despite our nation sitting on the edge of a fiscal cliff, The Biden administration continues to propose trillions upon trillions of dollars in new taxpayer spending. And sadly, not unexpectedly, the American people are beginning to see the consequences of taking their hard-earned tax dollars for continued and unprecedented levels of deficit spending. The Consumer Price Index has increased 5% from this time last year, which marks the fastest rate of inflation since right before the economic crisis in 2008, and a nearly 13-year high. This is in addition to producer prices rising 6.6% over the past year, the fastest increase on record. I don't care what the reasons are. I know that Americans are feeling it right now in their pocketbooks. Rising inflation at this rate is the same thing as a tax, and American consumers are feeling it as they shop for the essentials. Gasoline is 56% more expensive today than it was 12 months ago. Transportation services are up 11% since last year, and together, food and energy prices have increased 3.8%, which is the fastest rate since 1992. Middle-class families are paying the price for the lack of fiscal responsibility shown by this administration. It's time to get our fiscal house in order to ensure our children and our children's children are left a thriving economy. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, for decades, the Hyde Amendment has shielded the American taxpayer from being forced to fund abortion. And for decades, the Hyde Amendment has enjoyed broad bipartisan support. Even President Biden supported the Hyde Amendment as recently as 2019. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case. Now President Biden has reversed course, proposing we repeal the Hyde Amendment. In turn, this would require American taxpayers, no matter what their personal beliefs, to fund abortion. Madam Speaker, this is wrong. Every life is blessed with inherent worth, infinite potential, and sacred dignity. As a child of adoption myself, I would not be here today if not for my mother's decision to choose life over abortion. I urge my colleagues to stand strong in support of the Hyde Amendment and against this radical new position of President Biden. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committees on Energy and Commerce, Ways and Means, and Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 18 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House. And with that, I yield back.
Under guidelines consistently issued by successive speakers, as recorded in Section 956 of the House Rules and Manual, the chair is constrained not to entertain the request unless it has been cleared by the bipartisan floor and committee leaderships. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
As a father of four, I believe that life is a gift that must be cherished and defended. For me, a pro-life father of four, a huge part of my story is my son Isaac. Isaac was born with Down syndrome, and I know that with our love and support, he is capable of moving mountains. The sad news is that many don't believe that people like my son deserve the right to life or to reach their full potential. This is why I am a co-sponsor of legislation H.R. 18, the No Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act. This bill will help ensure that taxpayer dollars do not go towards taking away any child's right to life. Imagine a world where every child was given the opportunity to dream, accomplish, and succeed. The world would be a much better place, our future brighter than ever. That is why I will always support legislation that ensures every life is protected. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committees on Energy and Commerce, Ways and Means, and the Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 18 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House. And I yield back.
As the chair previously advised, that request cannot be entertained absent appropriate clearance. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, the American people deserve to know the true cost of government spending. Last month, working families adjusted their budgets around a 5% jump in prices
an effect of the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan that many economists predicted would occur. Despite these predictions coming true, many Democrats, not all I hope, are eager to use the same partisan budget reconciliation process again to spend even more. That's why I've introduced the Stop Inflationary Spending Act to require the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office to project the inflationary impact of reconciliation bills. This would mean the American people would know the impact on their family budget before Democrats use a partisan process to spend $6 trillion on unaffordable initiatives that dramatically increase the role of government in their lives and constrain growth in the real economy, which is the private sector and innovators, entrepreneurs, and millions of hardworking Americans. Madam Speaker, inflation is a tax on everyone. When inflation was a significant concern in the 80s, CBO issued inflationary projections for individual bills. Restoring this practice for reconciliation bills that spend big is common sense reform. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Iowa seek recognition?
I request unanimous consent to address the floor for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise today to recognize Chief Michael Neslagi, who has served as fire chief in Hiawatha, Iowa for the last 16 years. I want to congratulate him on his well-deserved retirement this week. Chief Neslagi dedicated his professional life to protecting and serving others. As Hiawatha's fire chief, he successfully started ambulance service in the area and spearheaded the creation of a volunteer firefighter program. Not only did he help establish the program, he also closely coached and mentored those seeking careers as first responders. He continues to be a role model for our entire community. When I was a state representative, we worked very closely together to pass GEMT legislation. Very proud we got that done, Mike. I know I speak for the entire Hiawatha community in saying we are so thankful for your years of selfless service and dedication to keeping Hiawatha safe. Thank you, Chief Neslagi. I wish you and your family the best as you begin this new chapter. It's an honor to serve you now in Congress, and I appreciate your service. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to speak 1 minute on the floor and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Our nation honors her sons and daughters who defend a country they never knew and a people they never met. This is a quote you will find at our Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Madam Speaker, I rise today on the 71st anniversary of the Korean War to honor the more than 5.7 million Americans who served, including the 2.25 million Korean War veterans alive today, and remember the more than 36,000 Americans and 1 million South Korean civilians and soldiers who gave their lives to protect freedom. As an immigrant from South Korea whose family lived through the Korean War, and as a wife and sister of veterans, I know that I'm here because of the sacrifices of our brave Korean War veterans. This is personal to me. Words alone cannot express how grateful I am. Freedom is not free, and each of you stands as a reminder of our nation's commitment to freedom and to the safety and security of our allies in South Korea. With that, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition? Oh, sorry.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I rise today to talk about an issue that is extremely important for my Orange County community. This week, my district braced for extreme high tides that presented another flood risk to Newport Beach. City workers raised sand berms on the Balboa Peninsula and handed out sandbags to residents, hoping to avoid another flood like the one we experienced last July. One Newport Beach resident this week said, "I've lived here for 10 years. I've never seen the bay so high or the ocean so high this early and before high tide. This risk of flood in our communities is real. This week, Lieutenant General Spellman from the Army Corps said the erosion in our community was not unique. I agree that this is an issue all around California, but the difference is Orange County problem was brought by the federal man-made projects that permanently stopped natural sand flow onto our beaches. The Army Corps creates this issue, and this is their job to ensure the final stages of sand replenishment are made a priority. The safety of our community is at risk, and we are one natural disaster away from devastating damage. I will continue to work with local stakeholders to call on Army Corps to fix the problem they made. Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 4th, 2021, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, and still I rise. And I rise today not to speak of persons who die unjustly at the hands of the constabulary. I rise today to speak of members of the constabulary who die unjustly at the hands of persons who are among what we call the public. I rise today to accentuate 5 words: in the line of duty. In the line of duty. These words may be meaningless to some, but there are those who have suffered the pain of having to live with these words for the rest of their lives after having lost someone that they love in the line of duty. Emily Dickinson, the great American poet, reminds us that a word is dead when it is said, some say. I say it just begins to live that day. These words take on meaning for those who are left behind when someone leaves in the line of duty. And I'm standing here today in the House to make an appeal to those who have thoughts of doing dastardly deeds simply because a person happens to be a part of the constabulary. I would beg that you not consider these thoughts, that you abandon them. And I would beg that you, if you have the opportunity, to go to one of the homegoing ceremonies of a person who has left in the line of duty. I have been to these ceremonies. I have seen the suffering of the families, the tears. I have seen the children who will no longer have a parent to go home to. All life is precious. I've spoken many times about the lives that have been lost at the hands of the constabulary. But we should never forget that all lives are precious, and when someone takes the life of a member of the constabulary out of spite, for no cause that can be justified, that person, of course, has to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But that doesn't end the suffering, just as it doesn't end the suffering for the civilian who loses his or her life It doesn't end the suffering and the pain. We ought not allow ourselves to become so removed from the lives of others that we cease to have some degree of sympathy and empathy for persons who lose their lives in the line of duty. If a person finds some degree of comfort in knowing that a person lost life in the line of duty, then you must be a sadist. It's a sadistic thing to conclude that a life lost in the line of duty is something that you can take some degree of pleasure with. You need help. And I'm saying these words today, I'm calling this to the attention of people that I don't know, but I know what my staff has reported to me about persons who've lost their lives in the line of duty and how this number is ticking up and how many of these lives were lost senselessly. We must respect all life. I believe that we have a responsibility to those that we will never meet and greet to say to the world that we disapprove of this senseless taking of life as it relates to those in the constabulary. And I'm talking about those who are just sitting in a car and someone comes along and takes a life. Person serving in the line of duty. My uncle was a deputy sheriff. I had great respect for him. I conclude that I am where I am today because of words that my uncle said. My uncle and I were in his police vehicle, and I was asking a lot of questions. And my uncle's words were, "This boy is asking a lot of questions. I think he's going to be a lawyer." I didn't know what a lawyer was, but I respected my uncle's words. And because I had such respect for him at a very young age, I was less than 10 years of age, I concluded that I shall be a lawyer. Perhaps not in those words, but I concluded that I would be a lawyer. So all of my life from that point forward was dedicated to becoming a lawyer because my uncle, the deputy sheriff, well respected, proclaimed that I would be a lawyer. I thank God that he didn't say, "You know, this boy is asking a lot of questions. I don't think he's going to amount to anything. He doesn't know anything." A word is not dead when it is said. I remember when my uncle died. Deputy sheriff, well respected. I didn't make it to his funeral. I was in the sky over Louisiana on a plane trying to get there. And we were forced out of the sky by an act of God, destined to stay overnight in Lafayette. I missed his funeral, and I missed him. I want people to know that we who seek justice for those who have been treated unjustly, we don't do it out of some desire to see justice for one. I do it because I desire to see justice for all. I know what in the line of duty means to people. And I know what my uncle meant to me. So today, my dear friends, I stand here in the House of Representatives, proud to be a part of this great country, but with this very simple message. I beg, let's show respect and pray that we will receive respect for those who serve and those who put their lives on the line, such that some of them will suffer to have the words "in the line of duty" recalled as they make their transition, as their homegoing ceremonies are commemorated. I truly believe that this country needs to reconcile. We need reconciliation. There are just too many things happening now that are signs of this need. There's reconciliation that we have not had the opportunity to perfect. And I have suggested to the President that he establish a Department of Reconciliation with a Secretary of Reconciliation, just as we have a Department of Labor and a Secretary of Labor to deal with labor issues. We need someone to deal with the need for our country to reconcile our differences. I'm not justifying anything that has happened because of past occurrences with reference to "in the line of duty." I'm merely saying that there are so many of these ugly things happening that we ought to find reason to put in place a means by which we can have a discussion about them and properly educate people about all of the things that can make a difference in our lives as we try to adjust our lives for the things that have happened in the past. The past does impact the present as well as the future. And it's time for us to reconcile, Mr. President. So, Mr. President, I beg, give consideration to the establishment of a Department of Reconciliation. You would place on our agenda long after you depart from the presidency the continuation of the need to bring this country closer together, to help us to understand each other better, to move forward with a greater desire and love for each other. I pray that we will do this, Mr. President. And finally, I pray that I will never have to attend another "in the line of duty" ceremony. These things are related in this sense. There are people who believe that somehow the suffering that others have caused, that have inflicted upon people, somehow they are justified by taking the life of a person they do not know. I hope that we can prevent this from happening ever again. I know that it has happened, but I don't want to see it happen again. And I believe that we need to start this process of reconciliation. It will make a difference. And I pray that we will never again have to go to these ceremonies where we all leave saddened by the loss of someone who was but only doing his or her job. We need to resolve our differences in this country. There's no justification for what's happening. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.
taught me everything I know, but you didn't teach me everything you know. See you later, bro.
Not quite yet. I have this key though.
Okay. Okay.
Sarah.
Per- Pursuant to Section 11B of House Resolution 188, the House stands adjourned until noon on Monday, June 28, 2021 for morning hour debate and 2 p.m. for legislative business.